While President Trump did spend the morning and the afternoon walking back some of his tabloid talk, he did make a point of doubling down on one part of that Sun tabloid interview. They were the comments that immigration is destroying the culture of Europe. And one person has been squarely in the presidential crosshairs, and that is the London Mayor Sadiq Khan, with whom Trump has a running feud. The president made this unprecedented accusation.
You have a mayor who's done a terrible job in London. He's done a terrible job. And
if you don't mind me
take
asking.
a look at the terrorism that's taking place. Look at what's going on in London. I think he's done a terrible job. But I think that all of this immigration has really changed the fabric of Europe.
And he added, not in a positive way. Now, perhaps the highest profile Muslim politician in the West, Sadiq Khan, joined me earlier to respond to all of this. Mayor Khan, welcome to the program. How unusual, how surprised were you to see that interview in the tabloid The Sun by the president as he was coming to Great Britain?
Well, I think a lot of us were surprised, not just in relation to the timing, but what he said during the interview. I went to bed last night knowing there's this interview in the Sun and woke up today to read the interview, and it must have been a very difficult evening for Prime Minister May at the dinner she had with him last night. But I think some of the things he said during the interview will cause upset to Londoners and will explain, I suspect, why many Londoners, and by the way, they include Londoners who are Americans, will be protesting today against President Trump, some of his policies and some of the things that he said.
Let me ask you specifically about the things he said about you in this interview, that your policy of letting migrants into this city is very dangerous and very bad, that you've been very bad on anti-terror. I mean, he really is continuing this feud that he's had with you for the last 2 years.
Well, can I firstly say, it takes two to tango, and for a feud to happen, it takes two to get involved in that fight. I respond when I'm asked questions by journalists to the tweets he sends and to the interviews he gives where he volunteers opinions and views about me. I'm not looking for a fight, I'm not looking for a feud, I'm not tweeting voluntarily about President Trump. But the two key things he said during his interview which caused surprise to anybody who's an expert in these issues is one, that I was somehow responsible for the terror attacks in London. We lost 14 people last year in the terror attacks last year. And one of the comforting things for us was the messages of support and love from friends around the world, including America. But, you know, Manchester lost 22 people with terror attacks. Berlin, Paris, Brussels, Nice lost many, many people. We're all grappling with the evils of terrorism. And it's for President Trump to explain why he singled me out as the mayor of London, not other mayors or other leaders. But the second substantive point that he made during the interview was to link the increase in crime across our country. Crime has gone up across our country over the last 4 years. In fact, in parts of South Yorkshire and Manchester, by 61 and 60%. In London, it's gone up by 4% over the last year. And he's linking the increase in crime with the increase in immigration to Europe. I've seen no evidential basis for that. But secondly, I'm not responsible for immigration policies across Europe or even indeed in our country or city.
As you know, the Trump administration is now completely changing its asylum policy, and you've seen the controversy over its migration policy, the kids separated from families at the border. But he did make a sweeping statement in this interview that migration, allowing, I think he said, millions of Muslims or millions of people into Europe, has completely changed the culture and, as he said, upped the crime. How do you respond to the cultural accusation?
You know, I live on an island, and for the last 1,000 years we've had immigration to our island. If we didn't, there'd be no people here. And we're by the River Thames. And over the last 1,000 years, what we've seen in London is people, ideas and trade come into our city from around the world. And that's one of the reasons why we are the greatest city in the world. And my point to President Trump and others who have these anti-immigrant views is actually, don't be scared of diversity. Diversity is a strength, something to be cherished, not to be scared of. And if President Trump had the time to experience our great city, he would see examples of Londoners who are of Jewish faith, Christian faith, Muslim faith, Hindu faith, Buddhist faith, Sikh faith, those members of the organised faith, those that aren't. He'd meet members of the LGBT plus community, strong, powerful women and others, and see actually pluralism, diversity is nothing to be scared of. And I'm unclear why the president of a country as brilliant as America who has in its constitution enshrined some of these values, is so scared of immigration? Why whip up fear rather than addressing people's concerns?
So you've talked about if he would come to London. He has said, again, in this interview, that he doesn't feel welcome here. He blames you for being behind the protests and for allowing this blimp to fly over London. What is your answer to that he specifically doesn't feel comfortable and welcome in London, which is why he's not in London?
One of the things, not just as a human rights lawyer, as a former human rights lawyer, but as somebody who loves America, I've done is study the US Constitution. Read the speeches from Franklin to Jefferson, and enshrined in your Constitution is freedom of speech, freedom to protest. The idea, and by the way, we share many of those values, and our unwritten Constitution has similar rights enshrined in common law and other documents as well. The idea we would curtail freedom to protest, freedom to speech, freedom to assemble because somebody's feelings are hurt are just laughable. Can you imagine a protest in Washington or in New York or Chicago being stopped, or a banner being put down because somebody's feelings are being hurt? And by the way, we've got history littered with UK prime ministers and US presidents agreeing on most things with a special relationship, but agreeing to disagree on other things. Think of the Vietnam War. Think of the Suez Crisis. Think of Reagan and Thatcher, from the Falklands War to the Grenada invasion. We had here satirical programs ridiculing President Reagan, a puppet of President Reagan without a brain. And he wasn't thin-skinned. He understood in a democracy we have comedians, we have protesters. When President Bush came here in 2003, there were thousands and thousands in the streets because of the Iraq War, protested against. Well, quite. And so it's unclear why this president is so worried about the rights we have in our respective countries and why he'd want to throw them in the bin or suspend them during his visit. And by the way, today we have people protesting against President Trump, but tomorrow in London we've got the extreme far right and pro-Trump protesters protesting. We're not banning those. I may disagree with them, but one of the great things living in a democracy is as long as you're peaceful and it's safe, you can protest. You
know, you mentioned that, and Steve Bannon, the sort of mastermind behind the Trump election, is in town meeting with those like-minded nationalists. You just call them extreme far right, but those people, and you haven't hindered that, and what do you think of that?
No, that's one of the things about living in a democracy. They should have the rights to protest and express their views. That's what pluralism is all about. My concern about the rise of narrow populist movements is that we've got to address the concerns that people are having, which leads to them supporting them. There's a reason why people are voting for these narrow populist parties, from Hungary to Italy and other parts of the world. And what I'm concerned about is when mainstream politicians normalise or give credibility or empower the far right. So, for example, when President Trump retweets the tweet from Britain First, an extreme far-right group banned from Facebook, the leader and deputy leader banned from Twitter, not only is he amplifying messages of division and hatred, but is giving credibility as the president of the USA to these far-right groups. And that's why those of us who are progressive have got to take them on.
Now, Theresa May, the Prime Minister, is obviously not from your party. You're in the opposition Labour Party. Nonetheless, what do you think of a president, and you've just talked about the special relationship, and the headline of the Sun tabloid newspaper saying, Theresa May has wrecked Brexit, no US deal?
So let me tell you the irony of people are lecturing me about the art of diplomacy, particularly President Trump and his supporters, about it's not diplomatic to have protests when the president comes to London. Well, I'd argue with respect, it's not diplomatic when you're about to enter a country to do an interview which criticises the Prime Minister and the strategy that she's embarking on, whether you agree or disagree with that strategy. And by the way, many Republican politicians criticised President Obama when 2 years ago he made the point, I think the valid point, that if you leave the European Union, don't be surprised because you're going to go from a market of 600 million to a market of 600 million where you go towards the back of the queue in relation to trade deals with the USA. By the way, those same people are now jumping on the back of Trump and supporting Trump and saying, because Trump's made the same point. What President Trump has said that if the Prime Minister embarks upon her Brexit strategy, we will go to the back of the queue in relation to the trade that the US does with us and with the European Union. The EU will be in front of us. And I think what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander.
He seems to be taking talking points from your predecessor as Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, the Foreign Minister who's resigned after having essentially, I don't know, backstabbed the Prime Minister.
Well, it's not for me to comment on what goes on in Boris Johnson's head. What people here are joking about this morning is President Trump is signing up to be the campaign manager for Boris Johnson for Prime Minister. I mean, it's not for me to comment on that. I'm quite clear in relation to Boris Johnson's legacy, both as the Mayor of London He left behind a massive mess, which we're still cleaning up 2 years later, but also as Foreign Secretary for the last 2 years. Nobody who studied our Foreign Secretary would say he's demonstrated diplomatic skills or the importance of getting on with allies, but also making good relationships with those we need to do business with. And I think many people, not just in the diplomatic corps, not just in the government, but also around the country, are breathing a sigh of relief that we appear to have a sensible politician now in that job, which is important.
And finally, I just want to quote from what you've written in the Evening Standard, the daily newspaper here, ahead of President Trump's visit. The very specialness of our relationship means that we expect the highest standards from each other. And it also means speaking out when we think one side is not living up to the values that we hold dear. Do you feel that you're one of the few public officials who actually does speak up for those values? I mean, NATO leaders have been berated, G7 allies have been berated. None of them really speak out.
Look, I'm quite clear. Look, I love America. I love Americans, as do many Londoners and maybe many people in my country. Because you are our closest ally, we have a special relationship, my expectations of you are higher than they would be of a leader of another country. I'll be frank about that. So my expectations of a president of the USA are different to my expectations of a president of Turkey or another country we could name around the world. Just like a best friend, the expectations I have of a best friend are higher than of just a friend or an acquaintance. So I expect this from our close ally. I expect this from other countries. Similarly, NATO, at its core, is the US relationship. The US, Canada, and the European countries, Turkey as well. And I just think, we shouldn't cower to people whose views we disagree with, particularly if they're close mates. I wouldn't dream of being scared to express to my best friend my views about something he or she was doing that I disagreed with. Similarly, I don't understand why our Prime Minister and others across the world are afraid to say to President Trump, you know what, we agree with you on many, many things, but we think you're wrong on this. This is why we think you're wrong. And I think it's important more of us are courageous.